Hello, everyone. I am joined today with Julie Ferwerda, and we are going to be having a very interesting conversation today that is probably going to be too long to encompass in one episode. And so that's why we've decided to really extend this conversation, and we're going to end up having multiple episodes where we really go into detail with what we're going to be talking about today. And it's definitely going to be a continued conversation. But today we're going to start off with this topic of leaving institutional Christianity to find God. Now, this is something that Julie and I have really experienced over the past few years, and it's become such a big part of our spiritual journeys. And it's really incredible. You know, the more I got to know Julie, I soon realized that we really had a lot of similarities in our journey and in our path. We both grew up in a very fundamentalist approach to Christianity, to God. And then over time, for various reasons, we both walked out of that and we began to approach God and spirituality in general with this completely different approach. And we're going to get into that in a little bit and exactly what caused us to rethink and question some of those things that we grew up believing to be absolutes and fundamental truths. And I'm sure Julie can say the same thing, but if someone would have approached me 5, 10, 15 years ago, and they would have said that in 15 years, you're going to be sitting here today talking about what you're going to be talking about and writing these books that you're writing, I would have said there's no possible way. There's no way in the world, because I was completely set. And again, these were beliefs that really, they shaped who I was. These beliefs about what I believed about God and myself and others really became such an identity for me. And something else we'll be talking about briefly today is when you make that shift from a fundamentalist approach to more of a mystical, open-minded, universal approach to God. Maybe that's not the best words to describe it. It can be a very a challenging journey. It comes with a lot of confusion. It comes with a lot of suffering, and you end up entering a season of mystery. You end up stepping into the unknown. But when that happens, that's when you find God where you least would have expected. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm so excited for this. Me and Julie have been talking about doing this for a few weeks now, and we're really planning out, like I said in the beginning, for this conversation to continue and to be something that is going to really help you on your journey. And that's what we want to focus on. We want to make this something that's relatable. And we know that there's so many of you out there who have experienced very, very similar things that we've experienced along the way. And I think the best way to really connect and to explain and get into what it's all about is by sharing your story. And once you start sharing your story, what you find is that you're not alone. We live in this sea of shared experience. So one of the first things that happened to me when I left my previous faith community, when I began to walk out of fundamentalism, was many people told me that I'm going to be alone my entire life because of what I believe and what I'm teaching now. And that this is what they told me. No one in the world believes the things that you believe.
Wow.
They said that, I don't know where you're getting this stuff from, but you are going to be on a very lonely path the rest of your life. And to be honest, it was at first. But over time, I started to meet people, and it was amazing. But everything I was told about the risk and what would happen if I took this path ended up being really nothing but a lie. Because I started to meet so many people along the way when I took that step of faith, and I began to, and this is how I describe it. I took a path of spirituality where I started to form my own beliefs independently. I was going to discover what I believed to be true because I put in the time to do my own research and to think independently. And I was going to form my own beliefs that way. I was tired of just believing things because this is what I was told I had to believe. And I know, Julie, that's such a big part of your story as well. So before I get into too much of that, we're gonna have a lot of time to really go into great detail with the journey and everything that comes with it. I want to start off by introducing my guest today, Julie, and then after that, she is going to share just a little bit of her story, and then I'm going to share my story, and then we'll see where the conversation goes from there. So, Julie Ferwerda is a nurse, researcher, author, and speaker who is known for her work on spirituality, faith, and personal growth. She has written dozens of articles and several books on these topics, including Raising Hell, Christianity's most controversial doctrine put under fire, and The Perfect Fit, Piercing Together True Love. Julie's writing often challenges traditional Christian beliefs and encourages readers to explore their own spiritual paths with curiosity and open-mindedness. Wow. So, without further ado, Julie, tell us about your story. Tell us about how you got to where you are now and what the journey has been like for you.
What a wonderful introduction, Logan. Thank you so much for all of those great words. I feel like you and I both have a very big heart journey invested here. And so I'm very excited to share with the people that we have cultivated relationships with and just kind of maybe give them some information about us and our journey that they haven't known before. So when I was getting ready to kind of share my story, I was thinking about, leaving institutional Christianity to find God, like sort of let myself sit and ruminate in that. And I thought of my experience a couple of years ago. I went to Arkansas to a diamond mine, and you can go there and you can pay $20 or something. They'll give you a little plastic bucket and a little shovel, and you can go out and dig in the dirt and try to find a diamond. And oftentimes, people will find like these little tiny diamonds that maybe aren't very high quality, but it's exciting, just the hunt of it. But every now and then, someone finds like a giant diamond that is worth a lot of money. And so they actually have like a billboard up there where they tell you, who's found the last really big diamond. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. But after thinking about that, I wrote something that I'm going to read before I get a little bit into my background.
Okay.
Finding God feels like digging for diamonds. Whenever you spend time cultivating your relationship with God or divine source through avenues such as prayer, meditation, the Bible, or inspirational texts, or anything where you are communing and aligning with God, you are digging for treasure. Every so often you find a small illuminating sparkle in the rocky earth layer. It brings a feeling of elation, reassurance, and excitement that you are on the right path. You put it in your pocket knowing that it's real and it's valued, but it's only a small piece of a greater reality. There are greater diamonds to be found, greater riches to apprehend, so you must keep digging. With greater devotion, you dig deeper into the layers of rock and dirt. Day after day, you return to dig, with hope and belief that you will find what you're looking for. On rare occasions, you find your reward, large, flawless stones, ones that alter your destiny. When you encounter such a priceless gem, you are never the same from that day on. Time goes by. Every now and then, you pull out your velvet pouch and dump all the beauties out on the table in remembrance, kind of like I'm doing right now. You recollect all the thousands, perhaps millions of hours you walked and dug and maybe even toiled to find these keepsakes. And you remember them each intimately. You would never throw away any of the stones you have gathered. They are infinitely valuable as individual testimonies to your hard-won truths. You keep them and they change your life for the better because diamonds are forever. As we begin talking about leaving our constraining institutional religious roots with all the implications, I want to take the opportunity to affirm and honor the importance and significance of your lifelong spiritual journey. So many people going through this process wonder if anything was true, which can just lead to despair and disbelief. Even if the outer experiences in one's search for God reveal themselves as smoke and mirrors, or feel as if they have turned to ashes, the heart of each person's search, where the diamonds were collected, were leading you somewhere good and safe. They were leading you home. I want to share some of the gems in my story. You see, just like you, I could not have been more sincere in my desire to find God during those 4 decades of my life, wandering through the distortions and the crooked truths in the halls of religion. And even though I eventually strayed from my conservative Christian and church roots, all those moments of the divine dance, the diamonds, were pure. They were true and real experiences that are embedded forever in my heart and my becoming process. And so were yours. And now I'd like to recount a few of these diamonds in my journey that led me to where I'm at today, out of institutional Christianity and into a much more expansive, wondrous, love-filled, liberated existence. All right. So, that just kind of came to me. And I don't want to belabor too much of my history in institutional Christianity because I can kind of sum it up with a few words such as abusive, fear-filled, insecure, traumatizing, self-limiting, and a strong, suffocating container. I grew up in a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Just voraciously hell-teaching church where they pounded it into us every time the doors were opened. And I just grew up with so much fear and insecurity. So I want to share the diamonds along the way. And I kind of just thought back through my life of the different stages. And the first diamond on my path was at about age 16. And this is where I first had what I would call the voice of God in my life, where I had just struggled with debilitating fear of losing my salvation from my, formative experiences. And I felt like a voice just sort of boomed through the skies into my head and said, I am your father and I have adopted you and I will never quit on you. And it was such it had to have come from outside of myself somewhere because it completely cured my fear of losing my salvation. My next diamond was at about age 24. I went through sort of a little rebellion period because I had grown up with the God that was like so angry and vindictive and, the littlest sin would send you to hell. And at home, I was growing up with a similar father figure. And so something in me at about age 24 really rebelled against that feeling that the axe was always about to fall on me and that I could just never be good enough. And once again, so I spent like a whole year sort of turning my back on God for me. Like I didn't read my Bible. I didn't pray. I maybe didn't go to church or any of the things that I normally thought I needed to do to earn the approval and blessing of God. And for the first time in my life, I just experienced this amazing love and mercy that followed me throughout the year and said to me, you don't have to be perfect to receive love. You are worthy of love because you are, just because you exist.
Beautiful.
That was a big turning point for me in my faith as well. Diamond number 3 came at about age 27. So at this time I had a baby at home and I was going through a really difficult time in my life. I had a lot of anger from my childhood, from all the abuse, and I lacked a lot of peace. I was kind of going through a big depression. My marriage was failing. My ex-husband at that time, we got together through our faith, but I felt like he walked away from a lot of that. And, he just wasn't a present or supportive spouse or husband. And so I just had a lot of really pent up anger and frustration. And at that time, I just remember like I read all the books, I prayed all the time for God to change me. I went to counseling. Like, I was doing all the work and nothing in me was changing. Like, I just struggled with my demons all the time of this darkness inside of me that just felt so alone and angry. And I used to tell one of my good friends that I felt like a salesman who didn't believe in my own products. Because, I never really had a testimony of that coming to Christ experience where you feel this like big change in your life. I grew up with this stuff. And so I never experienced anything that I would say like truly transformed me. And I felt like the products I had of religion and God and all those things, they weren't really working for me. And so I didn't really share my faith at that time in life, even though I was highly involved in ministry at church and everything. I didn't share it with outsiders because I just felt like, what do I have to offer them? Like, it's not working for me. And at that time, I kind of noticed too that if you were to look at the leadership in church, it wasn't really working for them either. Like, I saw a lot of hypocrisy in church, and especially in the leadership. So what I'm going to say about this diamond is it wasn't a very welcome one, because it didn't feel good, but it was leading me somewhere. It was leading me through a frustration process of just how limiting religion was for me. So it was one of the steps on my path. The next diamond, number 4, was about age 29. And again, I had this big booming voice come into my awareness, and it was very persistent. And the question was, is God big enough? And I was actually, when this happened to me, I was at a Christian women's retreat, and it just seemed so surprising because at that time I kind of felt like it was the voice of Satan, which I don't necessarily believe in a antagonistic demigod anymore. And I'll get to that a little bit more, but it was this haunting, like doom inducing voice in my head. And I felt so trapped by my religious beliefs because in my marriage, I wanted a way out, but according to traditional teachings, I couldn't leave my marriage. I didn't have a way out. So in desperation, I ended up kind of taking matters in my own hands, and I had an affair. And this brought about the most ground zero, devastated place that, I've ever had in my life. I had been involved in ministry. I was kind of up on a pedestal for a lot of people. And suddenly I wore the scarlet letter around my community. And I felt like I lost my friends. I, eventually lost my marriage, and just so many losses and devastation. However, there's a Rumi quote, and it says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." I look back and I believe that I was being challenged to grow into a wider faith through this ground zero event. And the real question being asked of me was, you remember when I heard, is God big enough? I think the real question being asked of me was, is the little g God big enough for you? This false God of your youth, is this God big enough for you? And it was a resounding no. Everything in me was rebelling against that God and taking matters into my own hands because this God wasn't coming to my rescue. So that was another diamond in my pack. It also did not seem like a wanted lesson at the time, but it really began breaking me free of my religious programming. And it was the start of healing my perception of being separate from God, which is what today I would call sin consciousness. It's that perception of separation and all of the acts that we do because of that. So that leads to diamond number 5. About a decade later, I read the book Blue Like Jazz by Donald Miller. And this was kind of a turning point for me because the book was really about being able to voice all of those doubts and questions you have without fear of retaliation from God. He had a kind of a famous quote in the book. It was, "God is like jazz because neither of them resolves. Neither of them is a well-rounded story with an ending, and it's your job to build a relationship toward them. It's my job to dig for diamonds. It's not my pastor's job." It's safe and good to face the deep questions that I've encountered. Some of those questions are, why isn't my Christianity working for me? Why is God, little g, so small and knowable and lacking mystery in church teachings? Why am I so different? I don't see others around me in church struggling with these questions. Is this all there is to faith and life? Those were the questions that I had. All right, Diamond 6. This was about 15 years ago, and I came across another life-changing book, So You Don't Go to Church Anymore. Have you ever heard of that book, Logan?
I have
Okay.
not.
It was kind of a turning point for me. It was like a cool glass of water on a hot summer day because I was not enjoying my church experience at that time in life, but I felt compelled, like, this is what you have to do the rest of your life. You have to sit in church and hear the same sermons, over and over.
Yeah.
But this one challenged that model. And I finally felt liberated and, guilt-free about letting go of this tradition that I had upheld for myself and my family. Of course, my church friends warned me that I was going to be getting into dangerous territory because I wasn't fellowshipping with Christ.
Yep.
But, that really helped me to see the fear for what it was. It suddenly dawned on me that my church was not a place for real independent thinkers and questioners. It was not for people who could live from their God-given intuition and from their hearts. It was basically there just to make copies of people who were willing to be enslaved to philosophies and dogmas. And I just, I saw all that in my church. I'm not saying everyone's church is like that. The darkness of my church background feasted on people who did not question and did not want to live in the freedom and wonder around the mystery. All right. We just have a couple diamonds left. I'm kind of, wrapping it up here, but Diamond 7 was Jewish perspective on scriptures. Logan and I will probably be talking about this in the near future, but that was the next layer of realizing that our Bibles and most of our doctrines of the Christian church were based on false perceptions and misapplications of scripture. For me, learning some Jewish perspectives, it was like reading the Bible for the first time. And I realized that essentially none of the fear-mongering verses and teachings were actually in the Bible. Maybe in the modern English version, but they weren't actually in there, or in the Jewish beliefs. And this led me to Diamond 8, deconstructing hell.
Uh-oh.
Which led to immense freedom. And, a lot of you listening to this video right now, you know about my book, Raising Hell, Christianity's Most Controversial Doctrine Put Under Fire. It's been out for over a decade now. And that was the start for me of really unleashing me with mental liberty and in ways that I, for the first time, didn't feel afraid of anything with God. Once you realize that ultimate punishment is not there anymore, you're not dangling people over the fire, like true liberty begins, but it is also a little scary because you've still got sort of the shadows in the background, and it's a process of getting free. But I realized that there was life beyond the walls of institutional religion. And it kind of reminded me of Richard Rohr's Two Halves of Life religion. And earlier I said, how the church builds a really strong container and it's like suffocating. Yep. With Richard Rohr's Two Halves of Life, he talks about how the first half of life religion, it's important that it builds a strong container because that's where your identity comes from, your security, your certainty, like your place of belonging. It's a really important thing for us in the first half of life religion to have this strong container. However, the goal of the second half of life is to leave this container. My diamonds along the way were leading me out of that container, which is the second half of life religion, where you are free to turn over every stone and to consider every philosophy and possibility without fear. I have encountered untold diamonds on my path after this point. They aren't even buried anymore. I find them everywhere. I'm sure Logan can agree with that.
Absolutely.
So, I think the diamonds are put there just to keep us seeking, to keep us on the search for what is real and good and true. The litmus test for anything true, is that which leads us toward love and freedom. It's that simple. I mean, it's so simple, a child can understand it. So ultimately, our diamonds are leading us back to the greatest truth, and the greatest treasure that Jesus came to offer us, which is I and the Father are one. So that's my story.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I really love the way that you broke that down, and the whole story before it gave it a nice touch. And you're absolutely right. When I think about my own life and the diamonds that have been these milestones along the way, it's it's fascinating. And each each season, each step of my journey, now looking back at it, is the way I see it is it was a stepping stone. And, you know, there was a time when I would look back on my journey and I would almost like regret and think, oh, I wish I would have never been in that faith community, or I wish I would have never believed that, or I wish I would have never taught that. That was such a waste. And the truth is, it was not. Nothing was a waste. It was all part of the story. It was all part of the bigger perspective of viewing it from the first half and second half of life. And again, we'll get into really what that means later on. But yeah, so my journey starts with me being born and raised and baptized as a Catholic. And so everyone in my family was Catholic. My grandparents on both sides, my mom's parents and my dad's parents, everyone, cousins, aunts, uncles, just
Wow.
about everyone was Catholic. That's all I really knew growing up. And then when I was about 11, my family left the Catholic Church and became Protestant evangelical. So we started going to an evangelical church. And that was a big shift for me, as you can imagine, going from Catholicism to evangelicalism, because when I was a Catholic, I really didn't know anything outside of Catholicism. I didn't really understand what all these other denominations were. All I knew was that they were not Catholic, and I was led to believe that Catholicism was the one and only way, the true religion that Jesus created and established. And so that's all I knew. That's all I really cared about. But when I became evangelical, there was a shift in the sense of we became obsessed with the Bible. And so when I was Catholic, the ultimate authority was the papacy, right? It was man, it was the Pope. But
Mhm.
now we're evangelical, and now we're taught that the ultimate authority is the Bible. And so the pedestal that man, or the papacy, the Pope, was put on in Catholicism was now changed to the Bible. And I was taught at a young age that when I became evangelical, that the Bible was pretty much equal to God. The Bible was literally not
Right.
only the word of God, but God. It had that much divine authority. So I became obsessed with the Bible. I began to study it and read it. And I really didn't read the Bible that much growing up Catholic. I went to Catholic school. I went through the Catholic teachings. I went to mass every Sunday, but I didn't really know much about the Bible until I became Protestant, as you can imagine, because in Protestantism, there's a much bigger focus, and the Bible is at that place of authority, of ultimate authority. And so I ended up going to a Christian high school. And so all throughout my life, I've just been surrounded by Christians. My family, all my friends, my community, everyone I knew was a Christian. And especially being a part of this Christian school and going to a Christian, going to an evangelical church in a pretty small community, everyone knew everyone. And I was just surrounded by it. Well, senior year, I got to a point in my journey where I said, you know what? I've been in church my whole life. I've been raised a Christian. I was brought up in it because of my family. I've been going to church. I've been reading the Bible, but I've never really had a true born again experience. I've never really felt the fire of the Holy Ghost. And I probably saw somebody on YouTube who was on fire for God and doing street evangelism and healing services, and that really inspired me. And they were preaching a message of pretty much repent or go to hell, turn or burn is what they say. And it was there was a big focus on hell for the unbeliever, and then Jesus is coming back any day. So we need to make sure that we are, number one, true Christians, that we really mean what we say, because if not, then we're not going to get raptured and we're going to have to go through 7 years of tribulation on earth. So that's what really sparked this. Again, I've been a Christian my whole life, but I said I've never really truly surrendered my heart to God. I've never fully given everything to God. And so I had somewhat of a that was a time of my life where I really devoted everything, and I was set in going into ministry full time. I felt that calling. I felt like I was supposed to be a pastor. So after graduating, I took a year off before going to college, and I just prayed and fasted that whole year because I wanted to make sure I was hearing from God. And this was when Christianity, the Bible, evangelism was becoming who I was. And so I made a YouTube video not too long ago about throughout my life, I've had these different egoic identities and attachments where I had to be someone, I had to be this role, I had to be living according to this status in order to have a sense of self, which I call the false self. It's the ego. And this season of me being this on fire for God, born again Christian who was going to save the world, come to find out now looking back at it, was just another phase. It was another attachment. It was another identity that I was playing, that I was living out. And so what happened was I take that year in between high school and college, and then of course I decide to enroll at a Bible college, Oral Roberts University, online. And I am it's online because I'm doing a pastoral internship at a church while I'm taking classes online at Oral Roberts University. On track to become a pastor, studying theology, ministry, and leadership. And my first year in that, I started to I don't exactly remember what caused it, but I started to really think about salvation and hell. And I think the first thing that really started to cause me to think more about it was, and again, I'm in college now. It's my first year in college, so I'm starting to think critically, like most college students start to do when they leave home, when they leave with their they leave their previous community, whatever. So I started thinking about things, and this was the first time in my life where I was honestly asking questions and thinking for myself, because going through high school and being a part of this faith community that I was a part of, all of my beliefs were beliefs that were told to me that I had to believe. I didn't never do my own research. I didn't never study it out for myself. This was just what everyone else around me believed, and it was preached every Sunday, and this was the doctrine and the dogma, and you don't question it. I just I just went about it, and that was it. But uh yeah, I guess I started thinking when I was my first year at college, I was like, okay, this is kind of weird because everyone in my faith community, everyone at my church pretty much believes all the same thing, and they all sound the same. Like when I ask questions or when I bring up certain subjects, it's just like this. I feel like it's a response that's scripted. Everything just seems so scripted, and I don't feel like I'm having a conversation with anyone who is just genuinely speaking from their heart and thinking from themselves. It just feels like I'm a part of a program. That's what I was experiencing. And so when I started to really think about hell, what I realized was ever since I was a kid, there was something deep within me that was like, what if there was no hell? Or what if, like, imagine if Jesus saved everyone? As a kid, I used to think about that. I would never express that or talk about that with anyone, but that's what I would think about that a lot. Like, wouldn't that be cool if Jesus actually saved the world and then no one had to suffer in hell for eternity? And that's when I really started to question. And I started my first the first thing I did was I said, okay, if I am going to really go down this journey of rethinking hell, of rethinking some of the things that I believe to be absolutes and fundamental truths, I have to make sure I have to start with the Bible, because the Bible is the Word of God. And yeah, I know about these certain pastors and these certain uh, Christians who don't believe in hell, and they're writing books about it, and they're making YouTube videos about it. So I knew that there were some Christians that didn't believe in hell, or this whole notion of uh, making Jesus Lord of your life, lordship, salvation, or whatever it's called. Say the sinner's prayer, and then you get saved, and then you're in. I knew that there were different approaches and different ways to understand salvation and the whole process of going from a sinner to a new creation. I was aware of that. But for me, it was okay, if I was actually going to start to change my mind about this, I had to find it in the Bible. I had to uh, convince myself that the Bible didn't teach that. So throughout my college years, really without telling anyone except for one other friend who was on the journey with me. He was studying with me, and he was one of the first ones that sent me a video my first year of college, a YouTube video of this guy talking about how everyone is saved objectively, and eventually everyone will be saved. But subjectively, you don't experience it until you have faith or repent or whatever. And that was like the first thing that really gave me hope that this could be potentially true. And that's what really encouraged me to continue on with this private study that I was doing. But I was still very doubtful. And again, I had to really convince myself that this is what the Bible was teaching. So throughout my college years, of course, once you start that journey of rethinking or deconstructing, when you start with hell, you start going to other topics and subjects, because if what you believe to be true about hell isn't actually true, then you start asking questions like, okay, well, what else might not be true? So there was various topics, various theologies and doctrines that I was really looking into and rethinking throughout those years. But by the time I was a senior, I got to a point where I was convinced from a biblical standpoint that the notion of hell that I grew up believing as this place of eternal conscious torment for unbelievers in the afterlife was not true.
Wow.
And so I wrote my senior paper at Oral Roberts University on a refute against eternal conscious torment. And I approach it from a biblical standpoint. Then I approach it from a church father, early church standpoint. And then I approach it from um, my own intuition, what I always felt in my heart and why it never made sense to me. And I lay out all these different scenarios, and I really bring into question the nature of God in relation to hell, because I believe that what we believe about hell obviously has a direct connection to what we believe about God. And what we believe about God is perhaps the most important belief that there is, right? So that was the paper. And at this point, I I would have considered myself to be becoming a Christian universalist. So I graduate and I start really studying Christian universalist books, and that's really what is shaping my belief that ultimately Jesus will save the world, all will be reconciled, and death is not the end for repentance. So I didn't exactly know exactly what that was going to look like, once, if someone dies and they're not a believer, how they were going to have that second chance. And then I also uh, thought that there was possibly some kind of hell that was temporary, that was some kind of almost like a purgatory that enabled you to get rid of all your sin and almost purge the soul so that you could spend eternity with God. But ultimately, that's what I was set on, that Christian universalism was the truth. God was going to reconcile all in the end, and that was that. Well, after I graduate, I start to write some articles, and I just fell in love with writing after this paper. And I decided that I was going to write a book. And I wrote the book, let's see, I guess it was a year after I graduated. But between me graduating and me writing the book, right after I graduated, I went through one of the most challenging seasons of my life, where I was starting to publicly share my new beliefs, which this was the first time I had done this, with some of my friends and people in my faith community, and it didn't go too well. I was immediately labeled a heretic and false teacher, as you can imagine. And but yeah, pretty much I lost my spiritual community, and I had to walk away from that. And it was weird because there were other things happening in my life that also added to the trauma and the pain of everything else that was happening for me spiritually with my spiritual community. And so that really started, or that sparked my spiritual awakening. When I had the spiritual awakening, I experienced God for the first time in a way that I had not known before. Because as a fundamentalist, as an evangelical Christian, my approach to God was rooted in separation. So God was up there somewhere, right? I was this separate entity who was separate from God. And the whole point of my spirituality was to somehow get God to come down from heaven so I could experience his presence temporarily. And this would happen if I was worshiping long enough, or praying long enough, or fasting, or reading my Bible, or attending church regularly, or tithing. It was all based on my performance. That was going to get God to be pleased with me, and then God was going to visit me, and I was going to experience more of his presence dependent on my works and my outward observations and my religious acts. And then again, my whole perspective on God was distance. God was infinitely distant and out there somewhere. But during my spiritual awakening, what I realized was that God was actually within the depths of my being. When I was at rock bottom, when I was at the lowest point of my life, I was searching. I needed God more than ever. And so, of course, I'm crying out to God, and I'm worshiping more than I ever have before, praying, and I'm really expecting God or the Holy Spirit to come through my window or
Sounds like
come.
you were digging for diamonds.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what I was doing. And I was expecting God to come through my ceiling or something. That was still my approach, my perspective. But everything changed when I was sitting in silence one day, and from within, I began to feel and experience this warmth of unconditional love. And I knew, not intellectually, but within my heart, it was heart knowledge, the intuitive heart. I knew deep within my bones that this unconditional warmth of love was the presence of God. And what I realized was that this presence that's within me, that is one with who I really am, never leaves me or forsakes me. Doesn't that sound familiar? Now, my awareness of it might not always be there, but just because I'm not aware of it doesn't mean that the presence leaves me, especially when I'm having a bad day or when I make a mistake, which growing up, that was my I used to believe that if I was in sin, if I was sinning, or if I wasn't reading my Bible when I was supposed to be reading my Bible, then the Holy Ghost was going to temporarily leave me, and I was going to have to do something to get the presence to come back. So it was all conditional, and it was all dependent on what I was doing or what I wasn't doing. But for the first time in my life, I began to experience this presence as something that was within me, not something that was separate or distant from me, but one with my being. And when this happened, everything changed because I was transformed from the inside out. Once I discovered and experienced the presence of God within me, then I could start to see it in everyone and everything. And that's when everything changed for me. And that's what led me to write my book. And that's essentially what my book is all about. That journey of me leaving fundamentalism and moving into a more mystical spirituality, which, by the way, and I would love to hear kind of your thoughts on this, but growing up, the word mysticism was something that was very, I don't
Age.
know. Yeah, like it's something we definitely didn't say, we didn't talk about. And my perspective of it was something that was, I guess, esoteric and just strange. And I didn't really know what it was. But again,
Dangerous.
yeah, in my community, in my church community, there were all these things that we knew not to question, we knew not to discuss with anyone, especially the church leaders.
Mm.
And the line for that was, is it in the Bible? Is this exact word in the Bible? Because if it's not in the Bible, then it's demonic or it's dangerous or it's outside of God or whatever. And so we knew that. We knew not to even bring it up.
Right.
But I'm so thankful for Richard Rohr, because when I had this mystical experience, when I began to really experience God within the depths of my being, I started reading the Christian mystics, which I had no idea was even a thing until I had this experience. But come to find out, there is a rich history of uh, Christian mystics from the very beginning of Christianity who have been approaching spirituality from this mystical approach of mystical union, divine union, oneness with God. And so I started reading their books and understanding what they went through and comparing it to what I was experiencing, and it was also similar. And then I find out about Richard Rohr, who is a modern day mystic, and his understanding of the word mystic and mysticism was something that really helped me get over the fear and the
Me too.
subconscious worry of, oh, mysticism, that's something that's dangerous, because come to find out, it has nothing to do with what I was, it has nothing to do with what I was taught.
Richard
It had
has
to
the
do with,
best definition of that, which I know you're going to give us.
yeah. And I know I've heard it before, but maybe you have the better uh, understanding of it. But I think his understanding is it's to see God in everyone and everything, or it's experiential communion or experience encountering God through that approach instead of through intellectual
Right.
knowledge or experience, is pretty much what he says
Mhm.
about it. The word I like is just mystery. And I guess the word mystic isn't in the Bible, but the word mystery, mysterion, is in the New Testament many times. Paul mentions it a lot. I mean, Colossians, he talks about the mystery that has been hidden for ages and generations is now being revealed, which is Christ in you, right? And we see this all throughout the letters and throughout the New Testament. But yeah, that was such a profound shift for me. And that led me to studying, because what I learned was that this whole approach of, okay, you've got fundamentalism and then you've got mysticism, is really true for every religion, not just Christianity. Every religion has a fundamentalist approach and a mystical approach.
Yep.
And it tends to go from, we start out in fundamentalism, and this has nothing to do with fundamentalism is wrong and mysticism is right. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with, which maybe you can explain this in some detail about the first half of life and the second half of life and how it kind of compares to fundamentalism and mysticism. But yeah, it's just the journey. It's part of the spiritual path. If you stay in fundamentalism long enough, then chances are there's going to be an opportunity for you to transcend it, but also include it in a way. We're not necessarily completely neglecting and ignoring what we were taught and the values and the truths that we were brought up with, but there's a transformation that happens, and we embrace a more inclusive spirituality, a more mature, spiritually developed perspective. So could you kind of just talk about that for a little bit?
Well, I thought about just now what you were saying. Have you ever heard of the definition of a classic book? It's a book that you can read many times in your life, and every time you read it, you find that both you and the book have grown.
Yeah, I like
And
that.
so that's how I feel like, even me just talking about the diamonds along the way, like that's the whole point is over time, you collect these things within yourself. And it's, life is lived forward, but understood backwards. Like you look back and you make sense out of all these things. And the truths that you had as a young person still remain with you, but they have a different light on them. And
Yeah.
you understand them differently and more deeply. And like you said, a true mystical experience is just something exactly that. It's an experience. It's something no one, whether you hear God speaking, how many times have you heard a friend come up to you and say, "Oh, God told me, this or whatever," and you're like, "Oh, that just."
Yeah.
um,
Okay.
but we
Mhm.
all have this voice in us if we're attuned to it, and it doesn't mean that we understand it properly, but we're all on a path and on a journey, and we're making sense out of that voice at that time in our journey, but later we're going to understand it in a different way. And
Yep.
so we don't have to, like you said, exclude any of our prior path, which was kind of the point I was making. You're bringing all those gems with you. They were hard won truths, and eventually they culminate in
Mhm.
that second half of life understanding of God. So
Right.
you said so many great things. I feel like you and I have so much crossover in our stories. Like we kind of
Yep.
got here a little bit different, but and that's the same with the mystics around the world. Like in all the religions, the mystics have the same story. And that was so surprising to me because I started with reading, the Christian mystics, but then I would come across like a Sufi
Yep.
teaching, which is a
Mhm.
Muslim mystic or a Hindu mystic, and they would all say the same thing in different words. And it was really beautiful.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, let's see. I thought it was interesting that you had the Ground Zero event also. Like we both had, it's like you have to have this or something to peel back all that. What is it? The adherent, like our adherence to certainty and all the things. You have to like face that fear and go to the very bottom of.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was. I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
I did forget one of my diamonds, and as you were talking about it, it reminded me of it, where you were talking about how you suddenly realized that God was inside of you all the time.
Yeah.
And one of my diamonds right before the Raising Hell was I was at like a spiritual retreat with a organization that I was working with at that time, and we were actually at a monastery in California, and it was an all silent monastery. So we were having like a really meditative experience, and while I was there, we were doing a lot of, I forget, like vision quest type things, but not with any substances or anything, but just with like meditative experiences. And something came through really clearly to me that I had always felt like with the Trinity that I was on the outside looking in, like my whole life. It felt so lonely. It's like God, Father, Holy Spirit, but I'm out here like looking at the
Yeah.
Trinity. And that weekend, I had like the voice of God again just come into my consciousness and say, "You are on the inside looking out. You're not on the outside looking in. You're on the inside looking out."
Mhm.
And I felt so much belonging. And then Richard Rohr, like after that, I started discovering his writings. He speaks about this so much about you being on the inside of this family relationship.
Yeah.
So it felt like very affirmed through a lot of things he said to me at that time. And I realized I've never been on the outside. And it was a really big life lesson for me because I've always felt like I was on the outside and just struggled with that isolation in my faith. just feeling
Right.
separate from God. And
Right. Yeah,
so,
and yeah, that's essentially what religion gets us to believe from the start, right? That we have there's this whole idea of original sin, which is that you are fundamentally sinful and separated from God. That which is deepest within you is evil and wrong and wicked, and so you must do something. Something has to happen in order for you to be fixed. In order
right.
for that gap between you and the divine, you and God, to
Mm-hmm.
be closed. And depending on which denomination or which religion or which branch of fundamentalism you adhere to, there are different ways to get that fixed, to be reconciled to God. And each denomination, each doctrine will tell you that their way, their fix, their method is the one and only way that is inspired by God, right? But it starts with you believing. And this is something that we are programmed with subconsciously as in the first few years of our lives for those of us that have been brought up in religious fundamentalism. And so we believe this. And so it can be challenging when we start to walk away from what we were taught from our fundamentalism and begin to understand God differently, not as a deity in the clouds, but as something that is beyond the finite mind, that transcends all things, but is actually within all things and one with everything. And when we understand God that way, and we know that we're not separate from God, but is within the depths of our being, even when we have that first experience and we know that we've never been separated from God, that a separation is an illusion, because of that deep subconscious belief that we were programmed with, it can take time for that truth to become something that is very real and transformative for us.
We learn in
Right.
layers. It's like you hear it and then it just slowly works its way down, you know? You have
We
to keep hearing it and hearing it at different levels. Um,
correct.
it bears repeating again. I did bring this up earlier, but one of the biggest epiphanies I ever had, especially in light of all of the emphasis in modern churches on sin as being some moral failure, the biggest epiphany I ever had was the realization that sin is the perception of separation from God and others, and all of the behaviors we do based on that perception of separation. And it's so profound when you get that. Like, if you could live in the God consciousness state of awareness where you always know that God is in you and with you and living through you, it changes everything in the way you conduct your life.
Yeah. And I love the Greek word for sin in the New Testament, hamartia, which just means to miss the mark. So
Mm-hmm.
the question is, what is the mark?
Right.
Well, the mark is union, the mark is love, the mark is God. And so to sin is to fall into a state where we forget who we really are. And we live from an identity, from a false self that is not the truth. And what we believe most about ourselves is the most important belief that we have, because everything stems from that.
Right.
That's why I was saying earlier, when we're programmed to believe that we are sinners and that that which is deepest within us is wrong and separated from God, then we can expect to live lives that mirror and reflect that in negative ways. And the thing is, with toxic religion keeps us trapped in that cycle of you're always going to be a sinner, you're always going to be separated from God. So because you've got something wrong with you, you've got to keep coming back to us every week. And as you keep coming back,
Tithes,
tithes and serving and
guilt
doing,
offerings.
yeah, the more you do that, God's going to be happy with you, and you're going to be closer to God, right? You're going to get closer, and that's going to help you in your process of sanctification.
Once you wake up to all that too, you can see the deliberate spirit behind that to keep humanity disempowered and disconnected in their perception of who they are, what we came here to do, and how we are indelibly connected to God to be light bearers on the earth.
Exactly.
So,
And one thing that I've found fascinating is um, when I started studying other traditions outside of Christianity, the mystical and contemplative traditions in Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, and really just the East in general, what I learned was that through these mystical traditions, the focus is always on the self with a capital S. This is in the Vedanta tradition in Hinduism, but the self is not the false self. It's not this ego sense of I'm a separate entity. No, the self that they're referring to, the Atman, is your true self. It's the you that is one with God. It's the you that is divine. It's the you that is eternal. And it's pure spirit. It's who you really are. And so through these contemplative mystical traditions, the whole point of the spiritual journey is to wake up to who you really are, who you have always been. It's never changed. It's not about attaining this spiritual identity or this spiritual status. It's
right,
not about, oh, I got to get converted and become born again so I can take on this new nature that's actually just, the only reason God can accept me and love me is because now when he looks at me, he doesn't see me, he sees Jesus. Well, that doesn't make me feel any better about myself, and that doesn't really make any sense. But no,
right.
in the East, it's your true self
Mm-hmm.
is inherently one with God, and you experience that and discover that by going within. And when you transcend the ego, who you think you are, you let go of who you think you are by discovering who you really are. And once you discover who you really are, and you begin to live from that place of union and love and divinity, then everything changes. Your outer world begins to reflect your inner world, and you're changed from the inside out. And here's the thing about that: if you're living from that place, that means that you can't be confined and controlled by by the religious institutions,
Or
by
political, or medical, or any other institution.
it's experiencing the inherent liberty that is part of our true self, part of our true being.
You said that so beautifully. You sounded just like Richard just now. Like you worded it. I couldn't have said it any better. I do feel like that's probably a good place for us to end this session. And we have some great discussions planned for the future. Do you want to talk about what we're going to be talking about next week?
Yeah, real briefly. So a big part of, and I know I mentioned this, but a big part of my journey of really walking away from fundamentalism and embracing a more mystical, open-minded spirituality came with rethinking the Bible, because the Bible was basically God for me for many years of my life
Wow.
as an evangelical Christian.
Mm.
And I was taught that the Bible was every word from Genesis to Revelation was written by God, and that we were to be understanding it from primarily from a literal sense. Everything was literal. Everything was uh, historically true and scientifically true, and that this book called the Bible had all of life's answers in it, including the answers that we're searching for today in the 21st century. And it's completely applicable and relevant, and it's what we need to be molding our lives around. And it was a very, very serious thing. It was the most important element of my faith. And that's why I really went to Bible college to study it, teach it. I thought I was going to be a pastor and teaching it for the rest of my life because I thought it was everything. So next week we're going to be discussing what the Bible is, what the Bible is not, and we're mainly going to be covering this whole idea of biblical inerrancy, which is that the Bible is perfect because it is completely divinely inspired. God wrote every word. There are no mistakes. There are no contradictions, which is not true. And that's one of the first things that Julie and I begin to study and look into and eventually rethink and deconstruct.
We
And
have a lot to talk about next week. It's going to be
yeah,
great.
yeah, it's going to be a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome.
So,
Well, this was great, and I really look forward to that conversation. I know you have a lot to contribute to that, and so I look forward to your perspectives.
yeah, it's going to be awesome, and I think it's really going to help a lot of you who are viewing in today and who plan on viewing in next week and who are on this journey with us. So
We'll see you
that's
next
it.
week.
All right. Bye, everyone.